návštěvníci. Jo, už mává na mě, ne, ještě ne. Vážené divačky, vážení diváci, kolegyně a kolegové.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to the last panel of the conference on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Our sixth panel, the final panel, is about the legacy of the communist past. We will speak about how the communists are behaving. We have 5 or 6 presentations from colleagues from Prague and from Brno. I will introduce them, and during the panel you can ask questions in the chat.
Reprodukovat a budu je směřovat na jednotlivé referenty, tak jak vy to určíte.
So you are free to send in your questions.
It will take about 15 minutes for each speaker, and then we should have some time left for the Q&A session. So the first presentation is by Professor Balík and Hloušek from the Masaryk University, where they both work. They study the development in the post-communist and communist era. So I would pass the floor. I will pass the floor to my colleague Balík, who will start the presentation. Good afternoon to all of you. We will speak of communist parties in post-communist Europe, and we will focus on the 1990s. That is the period of communist transition. We will focus on direct successors of the former communist government parties.
So we will focus on the direct heirs of former communist parties, those political formations that immediately after the dissolution or banning of the former monopoly party took over at least some part of its heritage. Such were, for example, the Slovak Democratic Left Party, the Socialist Party of Ukraine, the Lithuanian Democratic Labour Party, or the Hungarian Socialist Party. The second criterion we use is that the entity in question has carried out or attempted to carry out some political transformation that would change the original identity of the totalitarian communist party. However, the results of this transformation, as can be observed now, these results were very varied. In the introductory remarks, we would like to recall that there were 2 naive ideas. The first one was that there will be a rapid and complete political marginalization of these political entities. Equally naive, however, was the vision that the main force on the left of the emerging party spectrum would be the revived historic social democratic parties that were the main representatives of the left in the party system, in the interwar or post-war political system, and then they were banned or in the background. So now, after 40 years, these parties would be resuscitated and they would become the main actors. So this idea turned out to be naive, with the exception of the Czech Social Democratic Party. Other than that, the historic social democrat parties did not manage to establish themselves as a significant political force. At best, they sooner or later joined with the post-communists, who soon returned to power, or they became marginal. What are the main questions we focused on in our research? What unites parties so different as the Hungarian Socialist Party, approaching in many respects the classical Western European social democracies, the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia, with its distinct neo-communist profile, or the German Party of Democratic Socialism, the East German Successive Party, with its peculiar maneuvering between a radical socialist party and a regional party or East German identity. That's one question. The second question is the following. What has caused some of the successor parties to make significant inroads in a competitive environment, often becoming, at least for a time, the hegemon of the left of the political spectrum? For example, the Polish Union of the Democratic Left, the SLD, while others have remained small formations, like, for example, the Socialist Party of Ukraine, the German PDS, or the Slovak Party of the Democratic Left. Third question we focused on, how come that some successor communist parties gained considerable coalition potential and a reputation as a pro-system force soon after the fall of communism? For example, the Polish SLD or the Lithuanian Democratic Labour Party, while for others, an informal agreement of other political actors on exclusion was in place for many decades, excluding them from influencing the political system, like, for example, the Communist Party of Czech and Moravia. As for terminology and methodology, we must distinguish between the term communist, neo-communist party versus successor party versus post-communist party. From the political studies perspective, there are big differences. There are differences. So we choose the term successor party, or communist successor party, specifically for Central and Eastern Europe. This is a type of party that is related to the previous communist party, but the current identity of the party is very different. This notion does not include new neo-communist parties formed with a time lag after the demise of the original Communist Party, like the new Communist Party of Slovakia, and as a rule, the successor parties do not include the heirs of other entities from the old communist camp. And last, terminological or methodological comment, the notion of political transformation of individual communist parties or the social democratization. In the case of Slovakia, Lithuania, Hungary, there is a break with the declaratory continuity with the previous communist entity, the rejection of the communist tradition of the party. On the contrary, those entities that have retained most of their original ideological armament and have not, in principle, broken the historical continuity with the old Communist Party cannot be considered successfully transformed communist parties, like, for example, the Czech Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia, and, without surprise, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Now I hand over to my colleague, Mr. Hloušek. Thank you. I will continue with presenting the results briefly. We do not have time to go into detail, so I will give you a summary, which is based on a series of examples, concrete examples. First of all, we must look at the baseline conditions for the development of successive parties in a comparative perspective. It has to be said that there are several factors that can be generalized and that play an important role in all of these cases. First of all, we must look at what happened during the communist regime and before that. In other words, the historical and political context of the particular country. Even more important is the nature of the communist regime that was replaced by the democratic transition, because this had an effect on the development of the communist parties and their transformation. Our typology is not perfect, but it is usable. I'm speaking about the typology or categorization of post-communist Central Eastern Europe, which was made by the political scientist Herbert Kitschelt. Kitschelt distinguishes three types of communist regimes at the end of 1980s: patrimonial, bureaucratic authoritarian, and national accommodative. The latter were focused on modernization, creating a modern nation, and in these cases, communist parties were quite successful in the transformation, in starting the process of becoming social democratic, because they were seen as, to some extent, legitimate and resisting the pressure of the Soviet Union or the pressure of the center, for example, in Yugoslavia, the Union of Communists of Croatia, for example. Even more important than the general historical context, which does not explain everything, is the specificity of the successive parties inside. In a simplified way, we can say it was the ratio of revisionists to revisionist reformers and orthodox-minded or normalizers. But it was not a question of whether there was a tradition of revisionism in a given country, but how many reformers there were in the late 1980s. If these forces dominated, the willingness to be transformed and democratized was higher. We also have to take into account other key factors, like the readiness of the party elite to transform the party. This is what I just mentioned, the reformists, liberals, communists tending towards democracy. But this is not only just the party elites. The question was whether the transformation of the Communist Party would be accepted by the membership of the party. For example, in the Czech Republic, the membership, the communist membership, was quite rigid. The historical relevance of the left also has to be taken into account. However, in many countries, in most countries, the communist tradition was not very rooted, very strong until 1945. We also need to mention a practical aspect, which is to which extent those successor parties managed to maintain the property and financial base necessary for the new party to establish itself in new conditions. And finally, I'd like to mention the impact of the center-periphery conflict. This conflict line played an important role in the national accommodation regimes, where at the end of 1980s, the local communist parties, like in Slovakia and Croatia or Lithuania and Hungary, where communists started supporting the efforts of emancipation or autonomy, and this trend was connected to a gradual liberalization of the regime. And here, the conditions were the most appropriate for the successive communist parties to be transformed into social democratic parties. Don't be scared by this table. It is not very sophisticated. It's a summary of something that is quite evident, but it's good to be aware of it. If we look back at the 1990s, suddenly a party embodying the regime became anti-regime. Here, when we say regime, we don't mean the communist regime. It's the newly created democratic policy. And the transformed and non-transformed communist parties had to go through this phase. Some of them adapted to the democratic conditions. They became somehow legitimate within the system. And some of them managed to even gain power in the government, like in Lithuania or in other countries. They were able to adapt. So to summarize all of the above, we see that in principle we cannot speak of common destinies of the successor parties. The transformation varied. The initial conditions and situations of the individual state parties at the beginning of the transition were so different that they led to different outcomes. What was common, however, and what is interesting to compare, was the fact that was what happened inside the political parties, the interactions that led to the victory or failure of the party. Also, I have to say that the transformation of the communist parties is still not much researched by historians. It's studied more by political scientists. These successor parties have remained part of the political systems of the they are still in the political scene today, up to the present day, whether we like it or not. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you to our Brno colleagues for the presentation, and thank you also for keeping with the time. We will get back to the theme discussed at the end of this panel in the Q&A session. Our second speaker is Juraj Marušiak, who who is a historian and political sciences at the Institute of Political Science of the Slovak Academy in Bratislava. He's our Slovak colleagues, and he focuses on comparative politics and international relations in the region of Central and Eastern Europe after 1989. He also focuses on the Visegrad Group countries, Russia, Ukraine, and Moldova, and has participated in international research projects on the history of the dissident movement in Slovakia. We've experienced together a number of conferences. This one is an online version of it, and I hope that we will soon meet each other live. Today, Juraj will talk about the attitudes of and the role of the communist past in the Visegrad countries. Good afternoon. Thank you for your introduction. My topic was partly covered by what my previously speaking colleagues said. I will speak of collective memory as an awareness of a shared past that plays a significant role in the process of constructing political identities. It becomes one of the key legitimizing formulas defining who can be considered as ours or as other. In this way, it becomes part of the present. The experience of the past thus becomes a constitutive element of political identity, especially in moments of change, as political elites derive their legitimacy from it. In the words of Jacques Le Goff, every society, every political regime seeks a founding or a starting point. In the case of post-communist societies, such a point becomes the beginning of the process of post-communist transition or the decisive moment of regime change. The interest of the political elites of Central Europe after 1989 became to incorporate the narrative of the communist past into the collective so-called cultural, that is, institutionalized memory as a tool of homogenization of society. However, according to Jan Assmann, these attempts to consolidate the official interpretation of the past run up against concrete individual or group experiences, and therefore this issue becomes not only a factor of political consolidation, but also a subject of political and social conflict. The perception of the past is also related to the position of individuals who were in different ways actors in the historical events in question. The aim of the present paper is to analyze the role of attitudes towards the communist past in structuring political identities in the Visegrad Group countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. The primary focus is on the construction of the party system with the intention of identifying to what extent the question of the relationship to the pre-1989 political regime had an impact on the formation of political cleavages in terms of ideological cleavages, but also on the coalition strategies of the decisive political actors in the four states. Lubomír Kopeček and Vít Hloušek consider the conflict of the communism anti-communism axis as a residual cleavage, which implies its gradual weakening or disappearance. This cleavage should be distinguished from the conflict line concerning support for the regime, as most of the successor entities do not claim continuity with the pre-1989 politics and do not question the regime of liberal democracy. In contrast to the general forget and forgive approach practiced in Europe before the Second World War, but also in the so-called Spanish way of overcoming the legacy of the authoritarian regime, the principle of remember and punish is rather applied in the post-communist states. This is particularly true in Germany and the Czech Republic in terms of access to public office and work in state institutions, where the principle of collective guilt has been applied. On the other hand, the representatives of the ancient regime did not lose their legal right to participate in political competition, as was the case after the Second World War. In analyzing the factors that influence its presence in the political competition, whether in the form of weakening or persistence, we'll focus on the following questions. First, the level of confrontation between communist elites and the political opposition in each state prior to the 1989. The role of communist elites in the transition processes, and third, the performance of successor entities of communist parties in political competition and their relevance in terms of coalition building.
Konflikt, ktorý v spoločnosti vyvolal vojnový stav v roku 1981. Na druhej strane teda poľský model sa stal ako
Polish model is characterized by Kichelt is seen as a national consensual with a greater degree of openness to the West and tolerance of opposition. On the other hand, however, the conflict between the opposition and the Communist Party was triggered by the declaration of the so-called state of war in 1981, and this conflict was not alleviated even by reforms towards liberalization of the regime and the establishment of the rule of law in the second half of the 1980s. The low legitimacy of the regime in the face of economic problems deepened the conflict. Nevertheless, a roundtable transition took place in Poland, which became an aspiration for other Central European states, except Romania. The period of the communist regime is associated not only with political unfreedom, but also with the loss of state sovereignty. Therefore, the period after 1945 is interpreted outside the framework of the periodization of national statehood, and the activities of memory institutions, such as the institution of national memory, are defined in this way. While 1939 is considered the end of the Second Republic, the beginning of the Third Republic is dated 1989 or 1990, depending on the political affiliation of the authors. The compromise of the Round Table became the object of criticism by the radically oriented Part Solidarity and other communist groups. Although the former Polish United Workers' Party was transformed into social democracy and later into the Alliance of the Democratic Left with a social democratic orientation, in terms of coalition building, the grouping remained isolated. It could only rely on the agrarian Polish People's Party, which after 1947 was a satellite of the communists. The attempt of the Union of Labour to create a left overcoming the dividing lines was not successful, and the party did not gain much influence. The relationship to the past was more important than pragmatic issues. A potential compromise was rejected by the anti-communist right even when the constitution was being drafted in 1997. Although radical anti-communism was compromised for a long time after the scandals related to the abuse of transitional justice in the political struggle, the SLD overcame its isolation briefly in 2006 to 2008, when it formed the Left and Democrats bloc with the participation of the post-dissident Democratic Party, which was the successor entity of the Freedom Union. As far as the Czech Republic is concerned, the normalization regime of the 1970s and 1980s had the character of a frozen post-totalitarian regime, with communist elites resisting attempts at political liberalization, since the source of their legitimacy was the suppression of the 1968 attempt at democratization through the invasion of Warsaw Pact troops, and the potential for the Communist Party to implement reforms was virtually eliminated as a result of the normalization purges. The harsh treatment of the opposition before 1989, the passive role of the Communist Party in bringing about political change, and the failure of the transformation of the Communist Party caused the rapid growth of anti-communist discourse. It concerned not only the issues of transitional justice and the establishment of historical justice, but also the stabilization and consolidation of the power base of the new regime, its moral and ideological legitimization. Ultimately, however, from the autumn of 1990 onwards, anti-communism became part of the instruments for legitimizing the conception of the political and socio-economic model promoted by right-wing parties such as ODS, ODA and KDU-ČSL. Another important dimension of the anti-communist wave was not only the removal from power of the Communist Party of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, but also the gradual removal of a substantial part of the people associated with dissent and prominent signatories of the Charter 77. In Slovakia, the perception of the communist regime differed from that of the Czech Republic, even though they were two parts of the same state. Even so, there have been characterizations comparing the nature of the normalization regime in Slovakia to those in Poland and Hungary. A number of former prominent representatives of the communist regime supported the civic movement Public Against Violence, and the last communist Speaker of Parliament, Rudolf Schuster, became President of the Slovak Republic in 1999. Vo svojej agende po roku 2006 častokrát pripomínala niektoré prvky komunistickej ideológie v pozitívnom svetle. Questions of the perception of the former regime resonated to a less extent after 2002, and we should also mention the Smer and Social Democratic Party, which came to power in 2006 and absorbed not only the post-communist SDL, but also the anti-communist Social Democratic Party with Fico as chairman. The last country of the V4 countries is Hungary, which after the first free election after 1994 remained politically isolated due to growing nationalism and ruling parties. The MSS is one of the pro-Western parties, and during its rule it had the support of big business despite its social democratic agenda. On the other hand, the election campaign of Fidesz and of Orbán campaign was anti-communist, and the socialists were also accused of links to Russia. The new wave of anti-communism in Central Europe after 1990 has several causes. In the case of Czech Republic and Slovakia, it stems from the radicalization of the right in an attempt to defeat the ruling social democratic entities. In Slovakia, however, it was also caused by the rise of neo-communist elements in the agenda of Smer, social democracy, and in particular the deputy leader of the party, Luboš Bláha. In the Czech Republic, in turn, it stems from the gradual and slow relaxation of the isolation of the Communist Party of Czech and Moravia, which supported Miloš Zeman in the direct presidential election in 2013 and 2018 and tolerated the government of Ondřej Babiš and the social democracy after 2018. Another factor was the escalation of the conflict between the West and the Russian Federation as a result of the so-called Ukrainian crisis after 2013, where support or criticism of Russia's policy is also linked to the question of the attitude towards the communist regime. In Poland and Hungary, anti-communism has become part of the agenda of the conservative authoritarian right and is its legitimizing tool in the politics of party control and ideological reformatting of the state. The rhetoric of the German-Russian condominium or the betrayal at the Round Table is no longer directed against the post-communist SLD in Poland, but much more against the representatives of the liberal conservative elites who pursued a policy of compromise after 1989. According to its founding declaration, the main idea of the V4 was to deal with the consequences of the totalitarian regime, but the practical implementation of this idea was very different in the individual participating states. And if the communist path is something that unites the V4 states, its interpretation divides them. Although the anti-communist cleavage is residual and does not stem from the presence of strong or relevant communist parties as anti-system forces, it has been undergoing reinterpretation rather than complete disappearance after 2010. Especially in Poland and in history, where those anti-democratic aspects of anti-communism are coming for this day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marušiak, for giving us this insight. And this is related to the third presentation of this panel, presented by Mr. Slačálek. He will focus on Czech anti-communism in the international comparison, Visegrad comparison. Ondřej Slačálek is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the Faculty of Arts of Charles University in Prague. He's a political scientist. His research interests include nationalism, extremism, radicalism, anarchism.
Často publikuje.
He also publishes frequently on this topic, and he will speak about the typology of Czech anti-communism. The floor is yours. Thank you for giving me the floor. Thanks to the organizers for holding this very interesting conference. My presentation is partly a reflection on how to conceptualize and classify Czech anti-communism and what it can bring us, and whether this can give us some conclusions that can maybe start a dialogue with the previous presentation of my colleague, Mr. Marušiak. Trying to conceptualize anti-communism means you are confronted with different problems. First of all, anti-communism functions in the public space as self-identification of certain actors. It's a polemic.
imputace nějaké pozice.
Sticker, it's an imputation of a position, and therefore it is much more a category of practice rather than an analytical category, as we know from texts by Bourdieu, Brubaker, or Cooper about identity. And this is true for a large part of politological concepts. We have to see the ambivalence of the use of these notions. We cannot avoid this. We should be able to work with this duality. And this is true for terms like democracy, war, terrorism. These notions are very polemic. There are analytical categories and categories of practice at the same time. As for this difference or diversity, that's why we need to conceptualize and typologize them. How to define anti-communism? I have come up with 3 elements of definition. First of all, the homogenization and essentialization of communism. The idea that there is one communism which can express itself in different ways in space and time, but there is a fundamental essence. Second, there's the term composite image coming from the analysis of Stanley Cohen's work, Folk Devils and Moral Panics. This means there are several attributes having a judgmental and explanatory function. In the case of communism, one of the key attributes are the crimes of communism. The notion of criminal communism needs no more explanations. And finally, as an implication of the first 2 elements, there's the telos of anti-communism, which is the exclusion of communism and communist subjects from democratic politics, because they do not belong, it doesn't belong there. Or exclusion from any kind of recognition. This can mean they cannot even be a legitimate partner in international politics. Or the idea that national history has to be cleansed or purged from their legacy. It's a view that these ideas are so far-fetched that they are out of the limits of mental health. An important characteristic of anti-communism is the relationship to non-communist actors, to the outside. And this relationship varies a lot, it fluctuates, and there are 2 main implications. Either the outside is in contrast to communism. So in principle, just by not being communist, it is favored. It is acceptable in principle. It is contrasted as the normal world, as something that, by the sheer fact that the criminal communists are opposite, this can be accepted. It's something that can be accepted, that is worth being accepted. In the anti-communist discourse, or just to finish explaining the first characteristic, democracy in anti-communist discourse often doesn't have to be justified, or it has its quality just by not being communist. Even some authoritarian regimes derive their quality just by not being communist. And then the second possibility is that in the anti-communist discourse, the outside is seen as contamination, and contamination can be caused by an important similarity with communism. A big part of the left is seen as somehow not communist, but close to communism. Feminism, for instance, is often seen as the new collectivist ideology that divides society, etc. Or the second option of becoming the contaminated outside is an inadequate reaction to communism, like the permissive approach that implies at least the fact that the actor is not aware of the seriousness of the threat or the moral seriousness, which makes them morally suspicious. Or it's a combination of the two, where the similarity has an explanatory function and serves to understand the reaction. The typology can be based on three questions. What is excluded? On what basis is the exclusion made? And with what intensity does exclusion take place? I suggest 4 different approaches. The first one is based on the analysis of historian Petr Roubal, who studied ODA party, which had a strong anti-communist identity, which actually it was devoted to liberal market project and building the capitalist utopia as the best prevention against the return. And I think we could use this analysis of Petr Roubal. We could extend it to the Civic Democratic Party of Václav Klaus. This notion already implies an anti-communism of the past, facing the this means the actors another option is to base the typology on escalating criticism of social change. I have come up with 3 levels or 3 degrees: anti-communism of denied justice, anti-communism of denied revolution, and anti-communism of denied violence. The first one is the idea that the new regime, on the basis of legal continuity with the past regime, denied a thorough reckoning with the past and thus justice to the victims of that regime and to society as a whole. The second level, anti-communism of denied revolution, is the idea that this legal continuity has prevented real fundamental changes from taking place, leaving considerable power to former communists who can overtly or covertly exercise it. And anti-communism of denied violence is explicitly articulated by rather marginal actors, such as the émigré columnist Rostislav Hedvíček, who states that the Communist Party leadership should have been hung. We can categorize anti-communism on political grounds. that is liberal anti-communism versus conservative anti-communism versus far-right anti-communism. Liberal anti-communism defends the space of politics against an invasion of values, whether communist values or conservative values. Left anti-communism is based on the need to cleanse oneself and cleanse the left from the legacy of the regimes and the political practice and political culture related to communist parties. Anti-communism of defending the status quo versus anti-communism of criticizing the transition that needs no explanation, I suppose. It's not only communists who were an object of anti-communism. Václav argues that liberals from the civic movement were an important object of exclusion or target of anti-communism. Other possible objects of inclusion were other political forces, liberals, social democracy. According to Václav Žák, it was aimed at liberals from the civic movement. Sometimes anti-communist framing is targeted against some types of practices related to the legacy of the previous regime, like exclusion, cadre practices, fundamentalism, etc. Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes, in their recently published book, come up with the term German ideology, with an ironic reference to Marx and Engels, describing the transmission of German norms and the consequences of the specific German settlement with Nazism as the gold standard of transformation. So they noticed that there was a clash with nationalism. Poles and Hungarians didn't understand why they should suddenly criticize their nationalist heroes that fought Germany. Anti-communism adopted the identity of the memory of nation, which doesn't work in the Czech context. There was an alternative view of the German ideology, the German settlement with Nazism was seen as an example for the settlement with communism, is the total exclusion and denial, including the legal one, characteristic of the relationship of Western and Eastern societies to Nazism, that is supposed to be an adequate response to communism, and only when this symmetrization is manifested will justice and adequate decommunization take place. And there's an interesting difference that was mentioned already, that unlike Hungary and Poland, the Czech, the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia remained largely continuous with normalization, and thus was excluded from the political mainstream. In Poland and Hungary, anti-communism has become an important moral component for the rise of conservative nationalist forces that have gained legitimacy by combining a critique of transformation, conservative values, and nationalism with a reference to the memory of nation. In the Czech context, anti-communism, even though I agree it was applied against a broader spectrum of actors, it was very much tied to the Communist Party. First, anti-communism of the future prevailed, and then anti-communism of the defense of the status quo prevailed. So in the Czech context, the Communist Party played a role which was elsewhere played by conservative nationalists who were anti-communist. By accentuating the communist past, it somehow stresses the relevance of the past. We can ask ourselves whether anti-communism is more focused on the present or on the past. Anti-communism refers to the past, but at the same time it represents a moral critique of the present, influencing primarily contemporary actors. And in the Czech environment, this aspect of anti-communism has been muted by the nature of the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia in its strong link to the past. My final question would be, does anti-communism necessarily have a conservative tendency? We have tried to distinguish between liberal, conservative, and far-right anti-communism, but we must ask whether the moralization of politics present in anti-communism does not clearly tend towards conservative rather than liberal positions, and whether anti-communism does not necessarily have certain anti-liberal implications. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Slačálek.
Přetáhl, ale na druhou stranu nás zase zásobil celou.
You didn't quite keep your time limit, but you sure gave us a number of possible questions, as we see in reactions from our audience. Our next speaker has a slightly different perspective, and it will discuss how memory is created and dealt with in the public space. The author of this contribution is Markéta Devátá, who has been working at the Institute of Contemporary History of the Academy of Science, and where she is a member of work group for memory studies. Her research interest focuses on the issue of communist ideology and also the memory of communism. Markéta, the floor is yours. Thank you. In my contribution, I would like to point out the potential of research on memorial sites, which can be a suitable reference field for thinking through the questions of how the past is communicated in public space, how memory is created and shared, and how it is instrumentalized in current socio-political discourses.
Tak, omlouvám se za zdržení.
Sorry. Let me start with a short trip. Before November 1989, the monument strategy during the normalization period was determined by the effort to restore the continuity of the memory of communism, which was disturbed by other reminiscences during the Prague Spring. In dozens of towns and villages, people tracked down Masaryk statues and busts that had been hidden in various places and reinstalled them. The iconoclasm of commemoration of the liberation by the Red Army after the August occupation forms a separate chapter. These had a central place in the monument's iconography and symbolism. In the early 1980s, Vasil Bilak summed it up in the ideological commission of the Communist Party when he commented on the ultimately unrealized liberation monument on the empty site of the Stalin monument on Letná. He said it was to be a symbol of all that was there. He also returned to the circumstances of the construction of several of the much criticized Gottwald monuments in 1973. I quote, "I know how it was done, how quickly it was wanted. It was a time when we were fending off a counter-revolution that was attacking Clement Gottwald." End of quote. Monuments to Masaryk, which demonstrate the close connection of commemorative culture with political regime, were reinstalled after November 1989. Alongside this, a new, largely repolarized memory of communism began to emerge, the common denominator of which was to point to the crimes of the communist regime. Already in the 1990s, more or less all the main motives of the constructed memory appear in memorial sites. The victims of the intervention, the living torches, the victims of the Iron Curtain, the suffering of political prisoners, the torture and execution of the repressions of the 1950s, the victims of the communist regime in general, and the first celebratory commemorations of November 1989. The central theme of persecution gradually broke down into several segments: in the army, in the churches, among the intellectual and political opposition, in the countryside, associated with forced collectivization, etc. Behind a significant number of memorial sites are the commemorative activities of the Confederation of Political Prisoners. In particular, the image of the 1950s, as it is presented in public space today, is its work. It began a new phase of monumental orientation in history, confirming the established tradition and passing it on to the next generation to follow. Today, the Parthenon of Czech communism era commemorations include Milada Horáková, Josef Toufar, Heliodor Píka, Jan Palach, Karel Kryl, and Václav Havel, to name the 6 most remembered personalities. If we look at Slovakia, the thematic composition of memorial sites in Slovakia is largely similar. There are, however, different accents, for example, by the central memorial sites established as early as 1990s at the Jablitze Cemetery in Prague and the Ružinov Cemetery in Bratislava. While Czech political prisoners began to seek social recognition of their resistance during the Third Resistance, Slovak prisoners sought recognition of political oppression from the end of the war. Such a perception of the past is supported by other memorial plaques in Slovakia. Others emphasize this continuity by listing repressions experienced individually. For example, political prisoner 1945-1946 reads the sign. Another difference lies in understanding certain events from the broader perspective of Slovak state emancipation. This is demonstrated, for example, by the memorial plaque commemorating the magazine Kulturní život, Cultural Life, with the inscription that its editors opened the way for the independence of beloved Slovakia. In the Czech Republic, we also do not find a monument commemorating the Hungarian events, which was unveiled in Dunajská Streda in 2006. Monuments and memorial plaques are significant also in terms of their memory-forming function, in that they tie together repeated commemorative ceremonies and rituals. But the reverse is also true. Memorial sites are needed for the laying of wreaths and the delivery of speeches. Today, we can look with mixed feeling at the 1990s initiative to build a memorial to the Third Resistance with a perpetual flame at the statue of St. Wenceslas, where political representatives could accompany foreign visitors. And though through media, they can have also society-wide impact, such as the booing of Miloš Zeman at Albertov in Prague in 2014 or Ondřej Babiš at Czech Radio in 2018. This is related to other levels of interaction, the legitimizing function, the guarding of their legacy by civil society, and naturally the question of who is a legitimate representative of civil society. In terms of promoting a particular historical memory of the communist era, we can trace longer-term functional coalitions linking the bearers of this memory and political groups. I am thinking in particular of the alliance of the Confederation of Political Prisoners and ODS and the Communist Party, with the Czech Borderland Club, which brings together veterans of the border service. The activities of the latter seek, not unsuccessfully, to return memory to the public space, which was significantly marginalized after November 1989. These two coalitions clashed over a third resistance that would symbolically simplify the complicated history of the 20th century into a sequence of three resistances: anti-Habsburg, anti-Nazi, and anti-communist. This was and is, of course, an unacceptable interpretation for communists, which, among other things, also calls into question the nature of the second resistance, appropriated for decades. They played the external threat to the Republic card against the enactment of the Third Resistance after February 1948 because there was insufficient social support. Hence, the media coverage of the Babice and brothers Machini cases as examples of terrorism where society has long been divided. In Slovakia, we can see this in the issue of how to deal with the commemoration of so-called famous natives, such as Gustav Husák and Vasil Bilak. Monuments play an important role in the politics of memory, as can be seen in the current events surrounding those that symbolize the era of slavery and colonialism. In post-communist countries, the politics of memory is communicated around Red Army monuments, where there have been and still are debates without result about whether they are symbols of liberation or Sovietization. In our country, for the 1990s, there is a talk of a tacit agreement to keep these monuments. For example, the statue of a Red Army soldier in Rokycany, which was one of those that had already fallen in August 1968, was removed again after November, and at the same time, the liberation of Western Bohemia by the Americans began to be commemorated. Statues of Soviet soldiers had already been pulled down in Hungary during the 1956 uprising. In 2013 in Sofia, Bulgaria, a monument to the Red Army served to express apology for Bulgarian participation in the occupation of Czechoslovakia, when a relief of the monument depicting Soviet soldiers was sprayed with pink paint. This was a clear reference to the repainting of a Soviet tank in Prague, which David Czerny wanted to point out, the loss of legitimacy of such a remark after the 1968 occupation. The Sofia monument became an object for the articulation of attitudes on other political issues, including the commemoration of domestic victims of communism. In Poland, monuments to the Red Army are supplemented by popular creativity with symbols of Polska, Walczace, or even swastikas, pointing out that the image of liberation is permanently burdened with negative connotations of the German-Soviet Pact, the occupation of eastern Poland by the Red Army in 1939-41, cutting the halt of the front in front of the rebellious Warsaw, etc. It is generally agreed that the sharp course of official protests against any manipulation of the liberation monuments was set with Putin and his politics of memory. All the connotations of the events of 1956, 61, 68 brought into the discourse by the events around the Koněv monument in Prague in 2018, and finally the events of 1939-41, which affect not only Poland but also Baltic countries, are indeed unpleasant. But in principle, only 1945 is important. For Russia, it is a symbol of victory of the Great Patriotic War, the liberation of Europe, to which it sacrificed the lives of millions of Soviet soldiers. Most of the countries of the former Soviet bloc are struggling to come to terms with the Soviet monuments that divide societies. The exception is Poland, where this symbiosis with the constructed anti-communist memory has become untenable in the public space. However, the politically enforced and de facto state-organized eliminations of the so-called monuments of gratitudes has aroused a rejectionist reaction even in Poland. A specific case is Germany, where under the patronage of the reunified state, they have been preserved, renovated, and gradually accepted to an increasing degree, and where the different treatment is due, on the one hand, to the unification of the legacy of Nazism, and on the other hand, to the fact that the legacy of communism is not a society-wide problem. The displacement of the communist past is also related to the desire to reintegrate into Europe and the Euro-Atlantic civilization. The expression of this intention was not only the first grand state celebration on November 17 with George Bush Sr. as the chief guest, but also the decision, supported by Václav Havel, to organize the main celebrations of the Liberation Days in Pilsen in 1990. Let us also recall the postponement of the celebrations from 9 to 8 May, which Miloš Zeman promoted in Parliament and defined himself at that time against the politically motivated and often abused liberation legend. to claim to belong to Europe again was also indirectly raised by the legislators by the 1993 Act on the Illegality of the Communist Regime in Slovakia in 1996, in which they declared the Communist Party guilty, among other things, for the programmatic destruction of the traditional values of European civilization. These and other acts of memory politics in the early 1990s, delegitimizing the former regime, also suggested a seamless mental break with the communist past. But as the hindsight reveals, this process was and still is much more complex. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this presentation, a very interesting one, and maybe we will return to this topic in the discussion. Even though we have not received many questions so far, we have about 20 viewers, which is a lot given it's Friday afternoon. So your questions are welcome. But before the Q&A session, we have one more presentation, which goes back to the political development after 1989. It is about the relationship between the approach of the Communist Party to economic transformation. So the panelist is Václav Rameš, who quite recently graduated at the Faculty of Arts of Charles University, and he now works at the Institute for Contemporary History. Thank you for having me. My paper will focus on how the Communist Party, after the Velvet Revolution, reacted to the progressive dismantling of the socialist economic system. It will be structured as a response to the following three questions. First,
prosazované v letech 1990 až 92 Československou federální vládou. Za druhé, jaký ekonomický program a s ním spojenou vizi společenského uspořádání nabízeli komunisté v této době voličům? Za třetí, jak
the communists offer to the electorate during this period, and third, how, or if at all, did the communists manage to push through this program or parts of it? The Velvet Revolution was a revolution whose actors were united primarily by their efforts to establish parliamentary democracy and to abolish the dictatorship of the ruling Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. At the forefront of the demands expressed by the protesters during November and December 1989 were the demands for the abolition of the leading role of the Communist Party and the establishment of political pluralism. Economic issues were represented only marginally. The chart drawn up by J. Krepfel shows that issues that can be understood as directly related to the economy were much less represented in the list of protesters' demands than issues related to the democratization of political life. In the chart, the items working conditions and material well-being were represented in only about 22% of the demands. If you look at the statements of the main political actors in November and December 1989, we find that the economic sphere is dominated by the demand for equalization of all types of property. The Civic Forum also made this demand in its statement, What We Want, at the end of November 1989. And we saw the statement, What We Want, of the Civic Forum at the top on the previous slide, and at the bottom a report referring to the statement of the Democratic Forum of Communists. Both texts advocate a market mechanism or market economy and equality of all types of property. Similar statements can be found in the statements of other political entities towards the end of 1989. The equalization of all forms of property did not take on the meaning of selling state property into private hands, but of legalizing private property and private enterprise. It can be said that the legalization of private enterprise, which was carried out by Čalfa's Government of National Understanding in the first half of 1990, was accepted by a large part of the communists and was not opposed even by the new post-revolutionary leadership of the newly federalized Communist Party. Let's also recall that the communists were also represented in the Government of National Understanding. The communists were therefore involved in the approval of the first steps of the economic reform that the government submitted to the Federal Assembly in March 1990. The first point of conflict where the views of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and those of the Government of National Understanding diverged was the abolition of self-governing bodies in state enterprises, which was implemented by the State Enterprise Act on the 1st of May 1990. Self-management bodies were established in state-owned enterprises in 1988 as part of economic reconstruction. They brought together the employees of the enterprise and had the right to approve the accounts or to elect and dismiss the company director. The architects of economic reform in the Government of National Understanding, however, considered the self-government to be an undesirable obstacle to economic reform and therefore advocated their abolition. Among the left-wing parties, the KSČ and the Communist Party of Slovakia were the only the Communist Party of the Czech Republic and the Communist Party of Slovakia were the only political entities represented in parliament that opposed the abolition of the enterprise self-governments, but this could not prevent the abolition of them. All existing enterprise self-governments in Czechoslovakia thus ceased to exist in May 1990. Now, at the same time, in the spring of 1990, the Communist Party gradually began to lean towards the idea of privatizing state enterprises, since they would no longer be self-managed enterprises owned collectively by the employees. Since the spring of 1990, the ideas of economic democracy and self-government, concentrated in the concept of democratic socialism, formed the backbone of the communist program, the content of which was disputed within the party. Part of the political language of democratic socialism within the Communist Party was a sharp opposition to the accumulation, I quote, accumulation of wealth in the hands of privileged individuals and groups and the selling off of national wealth into private hands, domestic or foreign. But this changed before the June 1990 elections. The original position from the first version of the electoral program, which stated that the party was fundamentally opposed to the privatization of a certain part of state enterprises and their sale to private individuals, especially to workers' collectives, was eventually deleted from the Communist Party's electoral program, but a similar formulation remained, in which the word privatization was replaced by the transformation of a certain part of enterprise into joint stock companies. Privatization thus entered the intra-party debate before the June 1990. This idea took concrete shape only a few months later. In the summer of 1990, the so-called spontaneous privatization started in Czechoslovakia. The legalization of private enterprise in May 1990 allowed the leaders of state-owned enterprises to take out of them into friendly hands those parts that had entrepreneurial potential. This spontaneous privatization reached unprecedented proportions in the summer of 1990. Its exact scale has never been quantified, but it was sufficient to make the problem of the so-called mafias, or nomenclatura fraternities, which were to enrich themselves in this way, a dominant political issue just a few weeks after the June elections. At the same time, there was a sharper polarization of the public in relation to the Communist Party. In the autumn of 1990, General Václav, the only communist in the new Čalfa government, had to leave. In September, the public was agitated by parts of an internal speech by Communist Party Vice Chairman Vasil Mohorita, who called on his fellow party members to take a greater political offensive, which many people understood as a call to overthrow the democratic order. Mohorita was removed from his position, and the communists found themselves even more isolated. Let's now take a closer look at the Communist Privatization Bill of November 1990. This proposal envisaged the establishment of economic reconstruction funds independent of the government, in which the assets of all Czechoslovak enterprises would be concentrated. The funds would be accountable to the legislatures at the level of the federation and republics and to the municipal councils. The funds would be able to lease or sell their assets, which would be exempted from the state and municipal budgets, to natural and legal persons only by bankruptcy or auction. The boards of trustees of the funds, which would decide on sales, would then be appointed by the national councils or representative councils, and at the federal level by the presidency of the Federal Assembly. Pending the sale or lease, the funds were to exercise ownership rights, in particular to control and dismiss corporate management and to make changes in the organizational structures of the enterprises. The bill thus essentially excluded coupon privatization from the game, and in particular excluded all three governments and their ministries from decision-making. Compared to the government's privatization bill, the communists envisaged much greater involvement of the legislatures and strong decentralization of decision-making down to the municipal level. However, the communist privatization bill fell under the table as federal deputies approved the government's bill on large-scale privatization in February 1991. In the following months, the communists' departure from the policy of national understanding was evident in the pages of the newspapers. Here we see a cartoon in Rudé Právo presenting the entry of foreign owners as a national threat. I quote, "Children, the Germans are retreating. The first American capital is entering the city." Coupon privatization, which the communists claimed would allow foreign owners to buy shares from confused small shareholders, was also seen as a national threat. In the spring of 1992, the Communist Party became part of the electoral coalition Left Bloc, which won between 14 and 15% of the vote in Czech lands and became the second strongest party. The charismatic and radical rhetor Ivan Sviták became the honorary chairman of the Left Bloc. With his rising star, however, the Communist Party began to present itself in language similar to that which appeared in the pages of the political tabloids of the time. In Sviták's metaphors, the government's economic reform was, I quote, "a question of life and death of national culture and a question of desertion from the meaning of our history." Sviták was a vocal opponent of the government's push for a large-scale privatization, which he described as a reprise of the Přemyslit import of foreign capital, leading to the Re-Germanization and Re-Proletarianization of the Czech lands through the selling off of national property. That was also a quote. In his language, Sviták highlighted, as the president of the Left Bloc, the already existing economic nationalism within the Communist Party and outwardly ignored the less nationalistic rhetoric of the author of the Communist Economic Program, Zdeněk Hába, who in debates with government economists tried to act as a serious partner in the discussion and to initiate multilateral negotiations on some communist proposals. Sviták's arrival meant a move towards a more radical opposition. The ideas of economic democracy and employee privatization that the communists promoted in their program were thus combined in the political language they used to present themselves in public with a nationalist rhetoric that underlined the confrontational character of the Left Bloc. The consensus on gradual privatization into the hands of the employees, while maintaining a considerable number of state-owned enterprises, which was one of the pillars of the government's policy of national understanding at the time of the first post-revolutionary elections, thus broke down during the period 1990 to 1992 into two dominant opposing narratives of privatization: the government's and the one promoted by the Left Bloc. These narratives had almost no areas of contact, and a compromise between them in the form of even a minimal common denominator was hardly possible. This led to the decrease in any coalition potential that the Communist Party might have had before. Let me now answer to the questions I asked at the beginning. How did the communists approach economic reform in 1990 to 1992? We can trace a shift from cooperation with the government within the framework of the policy of national understanding through the formulation of their own alternative to the so-called democratic economic reform to radical criticism of government policy. In the left bloc, what was the communist economic program and social vision? The original emphasis on economic self-management and economic democracy was overshadowed by the mobilization against the national threat posed by the influx of foreign capital as a result of the economic reform promoted by the government. And last question, which I already answered, in fact, how successful or unsuccessful were the communists in advancing their agenda? They were totally unsuccessful. Although the party was the second strongest political entity after the 1992 elections, its programmatic proposals had low coalition potential and were not implemented. So what does the story of economic policy of the Communist Party tell us after 1989? The most interesting to me is the demise of the economic democracy ideas, which were an important factor in Czechoslovak history in the 1960s and in the 1940s and after the First World War. These ideas, after 1989, lost their relevance, which is a major change brought by 1989. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Panu Ramešovi.
Thank you to Mr. Rameš. And we have some 25 minutes left now for discussion. So far, we haven't received many questions, but we do have at least one. And we'll see, perhaps we'll get more from our audience. And then, of course, you are free to ask each other questions. The question here came from Wojciech Rybka, who is asking if things still matter in 2021. How significant is the mobilizing potential of the relationship of the communist past in political competition? In my humble opinion, the connection to current politics is heavily overemphasized in professional discourse, as if it could help win elections. The floor is yours. Perhaps our colleague, Mr. Marušiak. Does it still matter at all today? Perhaps we could react in the same order in which we presented our contributions. What we mentioned was that the parties still play a certain role in the post-communist heritage. If I wanted to win elections, that probably wouldn't be the major issue for me, but it can help me, my candidate, to differentiate against others. It was mentioned here in terms of Mr. Babiš, who still is an unacceptable candidate for some voters. So I would compare it to something such as Beneš's decrees, the expulsion of Germans. These are issues that do not resonate on a daily basis, but time to time someone lifts this stick and hits with it several times, and then it resonates. So that's how I would describe it. I pass the floor to Bratislava. So perhaps Mr. Marušiak will continue. I could agree with what my colleague said. There still is the discussion about the legitimacy of the present-day regime and its individual actors.
Napríklad, keď v Poľsku máme vlastne práve debatu o tom, čo je vlastne skutočným začiatkom procesov.
In Poland, there is the discussion about what is the beginning of the problem. Is it the half-free elections, the election of Lech Walesa?
Ohlasila svoje rozpustenie a odovzdanie vlastne svojich právomocí symbolické samozrejme poľskej vláde, čiže po prvých súťaživých voľbách. Tento konflikt je veľmi prítomný.
This conflict is much present also in the agenda of political parties. It plays an important role. Similarly, in Slovakia, where we can see bigger activity of forces that ask for a revision of developments of post-1989 developments. So yes, it still is an important issue. It can also be a way of protest, of disagreement with the current state of affairs. Mr. Slačálek also wanted to react. I agree with Professor Hlouška, except for his mention of Ondřej Babiš. Perhaps for some, he is out of question because of his past, but he has managed to be an extremely successful politician despite it all. So this problem perhaps points out at the fact that we have reached the limits of this, say, weapon. But of course, the importance of this issue can return. I liked your analogy with Beneš's decrees. And we saw recently that the heritage of Nazism played an extremely important role in the discussion concerning refugees. You could argue that the theme was not so close, but it still worked. And I believe that the heritage of the past regime has been influencing us directly or indirectly. It does play a role now in the debate concerning the environment. it helps to frame things in a wrong way, just as we defined an oligarch in a misleading way in the past. And I believe that the Communist Party is now a burden for the Czech left, but we will still see results later on of this. Anyone else would like to comment? There is not another question. Then we have here another one by Jiří Kocian, who asks, I would like to ask whether it can be said that the position of the successor parties or the degree of their coalition potential or rejection after the fall of the communist regime may have been influenced by the new leaders. They were to some extent new people unknown in the wider public in the period after the fall of communism. And the question is addressed to Mr. Balík and Hloušek and to Mr. Marušiak. This was one of the key moments. What was the place or the conditions of the potential new leaders, the new elite? And here is the weak spot of the Communist Party, which didn't have a young generation who could take over the power. There were a minimum of isolated individuals who didn't belong to a group who would like to liberalize the regime or renew it. Whereas in Poland or Hungary, there was such group of people, younger and ideologically defined, and they used the occasion to seize power, and sometimes even had a new leader that had no or almost no link to the period of communism. So yes, this was a key moment deciding of the development of many faiths. Perhaps it was not a single moment, but it was influenced by the state of the parties then, of their condition. It depended on whether people looked for their future in them or if it was pure calculation. Mr. Marušiak, the floor is yours. In Slovakia, the personal factor was very important. Unlike Poland or Hungary, the Slovak Communist Party and its reformist wing was very weak or hardly existent. Those were individual people who didn't have the possibility to make political decisions. On the other hand, in Poland and Hungary, we need to remind ourselves of the national consensus approach in their version of communist regime. In 1980s already, they haven't seen much possible development within the sources provided by their membership in the communist bloc. The situation of the Slovak Communist Party was such that prior to the general strike, the leadership collapsed and the action committee was formed of people who were not in the top politics. Many of them were not politicians at all. Many of them reached to the top of the party apparatus by mere chance or coincidence, such as the personal charisma of Peter Weiss and others who were representatives of another new generation and were able to influence the public. This personification of politics was a source of great strength of the social democracy until 1994. But with the decline of Peter Weiss and the reverse process took place in the party. Peter Weiss was often seen on TV, heard on radio, and as the head of the Communist Party, one could wonder how different he is from his opponents. The Party of the Democratic Left, the SDL, didn't seem to propose much better solution than the Slovak Communist Party. SDL had a more centrist leader, but eventually he was replaced by Pavol Koncoš, who drifted to a neo-communist stream and supported Jan Čarnogorský's presidential election, but only for reasons due to his interest in Russia.
Thank you. We have another question here. Matěj Bílý is asking, what can we say about intergenerational transmission of anti-communism from the older and middle generation to the younger generation in the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic? Can the situation be compared with other V4 countries? The question is addressed to Mr. Marušiak and Mr. Slačálek, but it seems to me that the question about the generational differences could also be viewed in the general perspective of the history of memory from the last presentation. So, Mr. Marušiak, please. Well, I have to say that this question surprised me. I wasn't expecting it. There's an interesting current among young people, young activists, who are not so much associated with traditionalist Communist Party of Slovakia. They are not even very tied to Smer, social democracy, but they are active in even more radical representations like Vzdor, or around magazines like DAF2, directly referring to the movement of communist intelligentsia in the 1920s and 30s, the national left. And one of the representatives of this current, Lukáš Perný, is speaking against neo-Marxism, which he considers the biggest danger for Marxism. It's very interesting to see that this radical environment is often very close to outright conservative right or even radical right. They do not call Kotleba's party as fascist or neo-fascist, but national activists. That's what they call them. So that's what's happening. That's what exists. Partly, I suppose, the generational experience of their parents plays a role to some extent. In some cases, well, I can recall the experience of a publicist who was active in HZDS, and his son is today a member of a group called the Republic. So there is an influence, and it's interesting to see the activization of this national conservative left. It is nationalist, conservatist, and leftist. Mr. Slačálek, would you like to comment? Yes, there is an interesting generational dynamics. I would say that in the 1990s, anti-communism was very much generational in that it released a big space for the young generation. It gave it a weapon against the previous generation to remind them of their sins of normalization, the sins from the past. But then there's something else, another element of the generational dynamics, which came in the 2000s, when a part of the young generation, it was articulated by philosopher Martin Škabraha. So these people said, yes, the history of communism is important in a way, but in the public space, it blocks out an experience that is not relevant for the youngest generation. So it's how this history excludes the perspective of the young generation. It blocks out the public space. It's not relevant to those who don't have this experience. They don't understand it. One segment of the young generation in the 2000s found it therefore important to reject anti-communism for this reason, among other reasons, like which were political and philosophical. It was an important historiographical debate about the strong presence of anti-communism in the public culture. So the generational dimension was there, definitely. But I would not overestimate it. It applied to one segment of the generation. And if we simplify, we can say that a big part of the children of right-wing politicians or journalists adopted the anti-communist views of their parents. So there was not a divide between the generation, but Ms. Devátá may comment on this. Yes, Markéta Devátá and then Mr. Marušiak.
Zapnout mikrofon.
Please switch on your microphone.
Já dám přednost panu Marušiakovi, který evidentně chtěl reagovat na pana Slačálka, nechtěl?
I believe Mr. Marušiak wanted to respond to what Mr. Slačálek said. I wanted to give you the floor. No, please go ahead. I have a remark which is rather personal, not scientific. If you know me, you know I was engaged from 1997 in the Democratic Left Party. I was never a member of the Communist Party, neither my parents.
Nejakým spôsobom spojený či už rodine, alebo vlastným angažovaním v tejto strane, tých bolo skutočne aj v tej strane demokratickej ľavice minimum a týkalo sa to aj
we were very few in the party without any ties to the Communist Party. And this was a phenomenon that was not typical just for Slovakia, but also for Poland, for example. Poland
tá strana je v skutočnosti nie nejaké programové zoskupenie, ale je wspólnota biografii, spoločenstvo životopisov. Podobne, keď si zoberieme dokumenty strany demokratickej ľavice, odznievalo tam veľmi často
documents of the party of the Democratic Left. We can see that it was an environment of people who were somehow tied to the Communist Party in the past, and recently I attended the funeral of Milan Ptáčník, and this occasion, in a speech it was said that we have understood that we cannot give up our past, we cannot deny our past. So the factor of the past was a key factor creating the identity of these successor bodies, successor parties, and this contributed to the fact that these successor parties became marginal or non-existent. For example, Smer has lost younger voters and it has become a party of older generations. Thank you, Markéta Devátá. I actually see great continuity. In the domain that I studied, the memory changes very little. And the new generations are not noticeable at all. For example, in Slovakia, a man who is about 40 is now the chairman of the Confederation of Political Prisoners, so he's quite young and you can't really notice this in his views. And the same is true for the Czech Confederation of Political Prisoners. The young generation is involved, but these are people who are adopting the views of the political prisoners, and their memory is not moving in a different direction, not at all. Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up, and we have no more questions from the audience.
uzavřel jenom jednou větou. Mně připadalo fakt zajímavé, že ten dnešní panel jakoby svým způsobem odpovídal z různých
I would say that our panel gave answers from different perspectives to the questions we asked in the debate last week already. So the question, are we living in post-communism or in post-post-communism? Is communism really a thing of the past? And I think the answers are not final, so we can have another conference in 10 years and try to answer these questions again. So many thanks to all the panelists for their contributions, for the discussion. Many thanks to our audience, to our numerous audience. So I close the panel, and which will be followed by the official conclusion of the conference. Goodbye.